Hello and welcome to episode 31 Lunar Missions, Science, Politics, and Security Perspectives. Today we have with us a guest who has previously been on the podcast, and her episode was one of the highly rated ones in the military satellite domain. So I believe it's not only an on demand episode, but even I was very much excited. And in the future, we'll be having more episodes from this guest. So without any delay, I would like to welcome again Harini Madhusudan. Hi, Harini. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, sir. Thank you so much for having me again. Thank you so much for encouraging me to discuss the subject in detail with all the passion that both of us carry for the subject.
Yes, definitely. I really love your perspectives on these issues because I believe an expert like you in the military satellite domain doesn't only look at the political aspect, but you're also looking at the security and science aspect of these issues too. So yeah, I know that we previously had your introduction on the podcast, but yeah, definitely you have progressed a lot after that in your career and in your daily publication writing as well. So can you briefly introduce yourself, just giving an overview of your journey and how did you end up doing what you're doing at the moment?
Sure, sir. My name is Harini Madhusudan. I'm a PhD scholar. I'm looking at militarization of outer space and with the very carefully chosen case studies of India, France, and Japan, because the idea was to keep away from the big power politics and also focus at space powers that are doing great work, who have been there in space for longer time, and also have a lot of inputs to give in topics like militarization of outer space. Additionally, I also look at outer space from a broader perspective: commercialization, private sector, civilian missions, government strategies, and all of that. I'm in the final stages of my PhD. Very shortly, I will be submitting my thesis, and I've also slowly started teaching. So I've transitioning in my career as well. That's about it, sir.
Thank you very much. I believe I hope this transition that you're experiencing at the moment might turn out to be, a full scale position in this industry, because I believe an experts like you in this industry are very much important. Firstly, I still remember our first interaction through LinkedIn. I mean, you said like you're still pursuing a PhD, but from my perspective, coming from the space industry, the subject in which you were pursuing PhD, it's a very rare subject. I have never seen many people actually pursuing this kind of issues, because firstly, there are like two aspects to it. It's like, first thing is like, of course, it's not on the very much commercial side, but it's very much on the government side. And I believe the current space industry is very much on a full scale manner moving towards the commercialization. But it is very much important, the kind of subject that you have taken, to keep up a sustainable cooperation in the commercial world in the space industry. Taking care of the militarization aspect of this outer space is very much important. So yeah, thank you very much again for all the information that you provided us about your career. uh, and yeah, proceeding ahead with the podcast, as we know that there are several missions that have been recently launched. I mean, people have been craving for moon, I would say. I wouldn't say they are looking only towards moon, they are literally craving for moon now. I believe several governments, I mean, not the common citizens as such. So from that aspects, I would like to know why nations are shooting for moon, and what are the key motivations from economic, political, and security perspective.
Um, I agree with you, sir. There's a sudden increase in moon interest in the moon these days, and I mean it's happening for a few years now. But I think one of the primary motivations for countries to invest in the moon has been the scientific exploration and research since the beginning. But today, it has a lot of geopolitical color to it. There's also a lot of strategic color to it, uh, and the economic benefits that the moon poses. The possibility of economic benefits, I think, is driving countries to invest on the moon missions. Moon is rich in resources. It has water, ice, helium-3, rare earth elements, and also there is an expectation that it has precious metals. And these resources are expected to be utilized for various purposes, not just bring them back to Earth, but also like use it for further exploration of the moon surface itself, energy production, manufacturing, and all of those. Countries investing in the moon missions also want to assess the availability and accessibility of these resources to try and bring them back to Earth, exploit them on Earth, but also utilizing them in the long term presence that they want to establish on the moon itself. And one of the biggest plan or the human ambitions on the moon is to have moon habitat or work on establishing human presence on the moon for longer durations and possibly treat the moon as a transit point for further exploration. Geopolitically, the major motivation is to be seen as the first mover, a national prestige, or show technological greatness of being able to achieve various previously unachievable stuff on the moon, being able to successfully land astronauts, having robotic missions on the moon, like what India did recently, reaching out the farthest corners of the moon. This is a symbol of national prestige, but it's also a symbol for exploration and understanding the moon's surface further. It would also showcase a scientific achievement on the part of the country, so it that also leads for further geopolitical gains. Strategically, there is a lot of unexplored territory on terms of national security, but the ability to operate on the moon also provides countries an advantageous position for monitoring the Earth's activities. So, if I want to use my surveillance capabilities, I understand that orbits are helping us for surveillance capabilities now, but in the future, if I want to expand my surveillance capabilities, then I could probably consider the moon surface as a safer option than a crowded orbit. So that is also being explored on the moon. So essentially, we can see how, before when countries began working together on the orbits, there was a sense of competition and cooperation. It's the same that we can see now on the moon. There is a sense of cooperation, but there's also an underlying competition that countries are seeing these days.
Interesting. I believe you brought up each and every perspective from resource extraction to the competitiveness of the nations.
Yes.
Uh, and I believe there have been like several instances where I've been asked this question about what is the difference between the space race and the current era of moon exploration.
Mm.
Uh, so I believe, as you said, there is an economic motive on the top. Of course, the
Yes.
high priority is that. The countries are not in race to compete with each other. Like how many satellites if Australia has launched, then
Yes.
China is in the race to launch so many satellites. It's not like that. It's about if we are launching a satellite, what are the benefits our population is going to take advantage of from that
Yes.
from those satellites.
Yes.
But yeah, these are the like primary top motives. But yeah, under that, how space can be a power dynamic tool.
Mm.
As you said, there is an underlying competition. So I think the more capabilities you develop in every vertical, from manufacturing to services to the upstream market where you actually operate the satellites, that will define your power dynamics. I mean, the kind of military satellite dominance that we are seeing recently, I
Yes.
think we'll be seeing in a similar way on moon as well. But unfortunately, of course, uh, we as a humans going together,
Mm.
there have been like two different groups now, ILRS and Artemis program.
Yes.
So I really hope, I mean, the cooperation survives well, even though we have two different groups of nations going to the moon. So for, just to take a step back on your point of resource extraction. So from that angle, what are your thoughts on utilization and sharing lunar resources equally? And whether it is even possible to cooperate in a sustainable manner given the current geopolitical climate? As I mentioned, there are two different groups of nations now, aiming for moon. So what are your
Mhm.
thoughts on this?
I think the idea of sharing lunar resources has been pretty well established in the principles given to us by the Outer Space Treaty. It says international cooperation and fair distribution of benefits is one of the primary uh, uh, motivations behind human exploration of outer space, and all countries should have equal access to lunar resources and they also encourage cooperation and collaboration in the extraction and utilization of resources that are on the lunar space. So, principally, or in an ideal situation, all countries should be cooperating and distributing the benefits of extraction. But the idea that in today's terms, or what Artemis Accords necessarily tries to encourage, is have a small group of countries aim at exploring the lunar surface, extracting resources for their purposes. And if I'm going to use Artemis Accords as a group of countries establishing, say, a Artemis habitat in the future, then all of those resources that they utilize will be for the consumption of their technology or for their purposes that they're aiming at. So, in a realistic more situation, there is even though there is no competition in terms of utilization of resources, there is still some sort of a divide that is brewing in the aims that countries have towards the moon. It has gained attention also in the terms of commercialization and space exploration circles, because till now we have countries aiming at the moon, but tomorrow if we have a commercial person, if somebody wants to have a private mission on the moon and start utilizing the moon's resources or bring them back for utilization here, then how do we deal with such issues? The legal framework largely has very little that it addresses in terms of these issues. And this legal ambiguity has created further uncertainty regarding property rights on the moon, and it also complicates further efforts that are needed to establish an equal sharing mechanism. But so far, we still have a few technical challenges that countries are still facing with extraction and bringing them back to Earth itself. Extraction requires advanced technologies, and not everybody has achieved it so far. Despite these challenges, there are multiple ways in which they're trying to enable a cooperation on lunar resource utilization. Most of it has been in the form of dialogue and having to try and establish common principles. So that is what Artemis Accords is trying to do. It's trying to establish a few common principles that countries can look towards. Beyond that, I feel like ILRS and Artemis Accords might just become the two blocks that we might see competing for resources in the future. But as it is so far, we there is ample resources on the moon, and I think the technological challenges will still remain as a barrier. But collaboration uh, might still continue. Cooperation, I'm not sure. Collaboration, we might see a lot of bilateral initiatives or multilateral initiatives towards bringing resources back to Earth or towards utilizing resources on the moon surface itself.
Interesting. I agree with that fact that we don't know what might happen to cooperation,
Mm,
because given the current state of the industry, the way we are progressing, I mean, there has been a quite a huge rift between the Russian and the other nations, like from Europe and Americas, I would say, North America,
yes.
because these countries were cooperating with Russia for several science missions.
Mm,
For a matter of fact, one of the Mars mission was also cancelled because it was involving Russian cooperation with the European Space Agency.
mm,
Uh, but yeah, there are still some collaborations which are going on. I mean, there is some level of collaboration still on ISS.
mm,
I think yesterday or today morning itself, I just saw that a crew of Russian astronauts has flown to ISS. So that this kind of things we might observe. But yeah, as you said, full scale cooperation, it's uncertain, I would say,
mm,
for the moment. And just on the same lines, along with technological challenges, what other prime challenges do you observe for future lunar missions? I mean, I'm asking this question from the perspective as well, like what has possibly changed from the previous decades? I mean, again, coming back to the question, why now going to the moon? Why
mm.
we didn't went for the previous decades?
Okay. I think one very clear reason why there was a lag in the way countries explored moon missions was that the interest on the moon fell apart, firstly. Secondly, it is very expensive and it takes a long time. It takes a lot of time to bring a mission full circle and then launch it. So I think the cost of developing and launching a spacecraft uh, would run into billions of dollars, and it required at least uh, 5 to 8 years to come up with a completely ready mission. And along with that, it's not just time consuming and expensive, it also requires a lot of careful precision technology to be able to have a good success rate. So I think because of all of these reasons, I think the interest shifted beyond the moon towards strengthening our capabilities in the orbits. And I think the 2 decade lag that we saw in moon efforts between 1972 and 2009 from the US side was also because of the same reason. It's just that they shifted their focus, or most countries shifted their focus towards strengthening the orbits, expanding the capabilities that technologies can have in the orbits. And along with that, there were a few other small issues that they had to deal with. One is regarding having a more precise effort on the moon. This is regarding dealing with, say, radiation exposure, or dealing with the lunar weather conditions, and all of those. I think those took longer time, and they were dealing with the budget constraints that they had. Along with that, logistically, it requires a lot of international collaboration because complexity and the costs are involved. One country or one group of people could not have invested on such a big scale mission to the moon. So coordinating efforts becomes very important with priorities, regulations, technological capabilities, and all of that. They also needed to work towards, I mean, we still need to establish effective frameworks and international cooperation on issues again regarding sharing resources, data, responsibilities for successful moon missions. And in this case, now slowly we see Artemis Accords, the Lunar Research Station, slowly emerging as a collaborative effort so that they can pool their resources and expertise and ensure a more efficient mission to the moon. Scientifically, despite significant scientific knowledge that has been gained from previous moon missions, there are still many unanswered questions about the lunar geology and environment. So, understanding the origin of the moon, its geological history, potential resources, and the effects it has on long term exposure to lunar conditions have become some of the constraints or challenges that countries needed to explore or still need to explore before they work towards going on the moon. I think one of the biggest examples we can take of the uncertainty of moon missions is what happened with Russia's recent moon mission. We saw India and Russia both aiming towards the moon surface, and we saw like a 50% success rate, right? So I think that kind of an uncertainty is probably what stopped countries from aiming towards the moon much more than they pulled the efforts towards strengthening their orbital space capabilities. And going back to the question on why did we take so long to go back to the moon and what has changed now? What has changed now is the geopolitics, I must say, because we're coming back to a time where there's a lot of geopolitical competition on the Earth, where space obviously becomes a secondary aspect, but it's still a very significant secondary aspect of national prestige and scientific capability. I think the same thing must have happened in 2009 when uh, the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter was launched. And this was after, again, a 2 decade break in the efforts of any country towards the moon. And I've always wondered what changed in 2009. And the closest answer could be the rise of China in space. China has become somewhat of a motivating factor for the US to relook at the moon because, again, they're in a geopolitical race. Uh, we've also gone back to the geopolitical scientific trends that the Cold War had. So there is a lot of interest and investment on outer space in strengthening our capabilities because the geopolitical factors require us to focus more on expanding our surveillance and intelligence gathering capabilities. And but however, this time the space domain is much better than the space domain was during the Cold War. Countries are still working together while they're competing with each other. And the economic potential of the moon exploration is another motivating factor to look at the moon again. The discovery of water ice or the discovery of helium 3 probably is gathering investments to invest on the moon again. Along with that, we have the need to have a scientific leadership and also national security capabilities. So those are being strengthened using the moon and the lunar orbits as a motivating factor, because then we would have a different perspective on surveillance and in security ideas from looking on the other side of the earth. So I think these are largely what we could see as a shift in the way we look at moon today.
All right. So you mentioned like geopolitical factors has been the prime thing that has changed over
Yes.
the years. So from your perspective, I'm asking this question from the angle because recently India signed Artemis Accord, and I believe that move didn't came, suddenly.
Mm.
It was a build-up of a relationship between India and US, primarily through Quad, I believe,
Yes, yes.
which the former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who actually pushed up this cooperation to counter, several threats in the Pacific. So that relationship, led to, I believe, a close cooperation between US and India, which I mean we haven't seen before ever. I mean,
Yes.
these two countries have been completely opposite on both the geopolitical interest and both their, international perspectives as well. But now there is a complete shift in the relation between US and India. So
Yeah.
from that perspective, the blocks like Quad or even BRICS, how are these various groupings of countries working towards, reaching the moon surface, or possibly, in general, for the cooperation in the space? Can you extend a little bit on this?
Yes, sir. So just before I get to the question you gave me, I just wanted to re-emphasize what I said in the previous answer. When I said moon can become a factor for surveillance and intelligence gathering, I think there are talks about how you can start building space situational awareness capabilities from the moon or lunar orbit, so that you can get a different advantage than observing from the Earth. And this high ground advantage that moon offers is a uh, very advantageous factor or very beneficial factor for countries, because we know that the orbits are crowding, and with that level of crowding we don't know when what kind of a situation might come. And in the same context, if I look at bilateral and multilateral initiatives on the moon, it's a great thing that regional initiatives like BRICS and G20 are talking about space. And I think these regional initiatives should have spoken about outer space cooperation way before than they are doing it right now. And it's a big thing that they're talking about it in the year that we are talking about, 2023, because bilateral and multilateral initiatives is probably the future of space cooperation, because we no longer have the all countries or all of humankind kind of an approach to outer space. We have an individualistic approach to outer space, and then we will have a block based or a multilateral bilateral based approach to outer space. And this will help in establishing partnerships that require joint missions, sharing of data and resources, and coordination of activities, which covers areas like technology development, scientific research, astronaut training, and resource utilization. So when regional groupings like BRICS and G20 talk about it, the discussions are still at a nascent stage, because they're not talking about it on a large scale. Oh, we'll have a BRICS mission to the moon, or we'll have a G20 mission to the moon, but they're still talking about sharing of data or sharing of resources, or having collaborations in scientific research, or encouraging astronaut training and stuff like that. So I think it's going to transition to have a tomorrow we might have a BRICS satellite in outer space, or we might have a BRICS satellite that or BRICS rover that will go to the moon. So these it's still a far away idea, but it's on the way. And I think that kind of a dialogue in the bilateral and multilateral initiatives are a very good sign. I think one of the Artemis Accords then again falls under one of the best examples of bilateral agreement. Artemis Accords has 27, I think 28 signatories so far, and India signed. It was a very great initiative of India to sign the Artemis Accords, because I think India has recognized the futuristic outlook that the Artemis Accords has, and I think this type of international cooperation building. But Artemis Accords is also a bilateral agreement. So everybody is signing it as a bilateral deal with the US and not as a complete grouping. So I think these things we have to observe and see how the dynamics changes later on.
Yeah, I would
The
like to.
IRLS,
Yeah,
sorry,
just a minute. I would like to actually add on that. So it's a,
yes,
as you mentioned, it's a non-binding agreement.
yes,
So it doesn't actually bind the nations to the United States, because there have been countries like, I think, Brazil or UAE. I'm not, sure,
yes,
but I think UAE has been one of the nations who has signed both ILRS and
and Artemis, yes,
Artemis
yes,
as well. So yeah,
yes,
there are countries which are, doing both. Like I think South Africa recently did that as well.
yes.
Yeah.
I think countries are also recognizing the importance of both IRLS and Artemis Accords, because both the initiatives, even though they have some form of a block-based tendencies, both are promising different things on the moon. One is offering the deeper exploration, scientific exploration, and the other one is offering resource utilization, resource management, establishing longer presence. So I think the combination of both these efforts would be a great thing for the achievement of humankind itself on the moon. And in that sense, countries are recognizing, and the non-binding nature of both these agreements makes it even more special, because then countries can choose on what aspects they want to work with, what block or what grouping. And I think that that is something unique to the space environment, because as much as we say the securitization of outer space, there is still that sense of cooperation. There's still that sense of a common heritage kind of an idea towards the moon. And I think that's a very beautiful thing about outer space itself. In some ways, the original ideas of the outer space treaty is still alive. In case of IRLS itself, they want to propose a lunar base, and they want to establish a sustainable human presence on the moon. So it would essentially be the International Space Station kind of a model on the moon's surface for a long term, where we'll have humans going, visiting, conducting experiments, and coming back. And that also, they have said it is open to all countries to come and participate. So then we see a sense of bilateral and multilateral initiatives that are forming towards the moon. Additionally, we have the UNUSA and the International Astronautical Federation. They are constantly organizing conferences and discussions and all of those, which again encourages countries to participate more and like have further collaborative efforts towards the moon.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree with the fact that you mentioned. Each of the program has their own advantages.
Yes.
And I think this non-binding thing should be there.
Yes.
And I hope it doesn't change, given the fact that several countries have been aggressively taking the steps in the international domain because of their geopolitical interest. So let's hope for the best that this remains the same. It doesn't change actually, because it's beneficial for everyone, not only for certain countries, but it's beneficial for everyone if it's non-binding. And
Yes.
I believe we are right now at the end of the podcast. So I would like to know from your perspective, because these missions have been very fresh.
Mhm.
Recently these were launched. So
Yes.
what are your thoughts on the recent moon missions that were launched, especially by India, Russia, and Japan?
I think all the three missions of India, Japan, and Russia have something very special to teach us. All three missions aim to enhance our understanding of the moon's geology, surface composition, potential resources, and also it reflects the country's commitments to advancing lunar exploration and also expanding the common knowledge of Earth of the moon to all of us. So, by conducting these detailed studies of the moon's surface and potential resources, these missions are expected to contribute a lot to the evolution of the moon as a celestial body itself, or potential of the surface of the moon for, human presence or human exploration? Or is it possible to utilize the moon itself as a transit point between, our further missions to the Mars or further beyond that? So moon has always been considered as a potential place for humans to go and settle at some point. Or now the talk is about treating it as a transit point where you go refuel on the surface of the moon and then you go ahead to your further missions. So all of these, I think these missions will give us more detailed scientific knowledge on how this can be achieved. And even though the Russia's mission fell short, I think we had an important lesson to learn, that the weather conditions around the moon surface, or the conditions of the risks involved with the mission to the moon, is very dangerous. And I think that is also a takeaway from the missions that we saw this year. Japan's mission aims to study the subsurface of the lunar surface, and also eventually add to the knowledge of the geological evolution of the moon. And these things help us to understand, okay, how do we establish, how do we approach the moon further? How is the moon going to help us in a later stage, decades from now? How is it going to evolve? And stuff like that, I think scientifically, all these three missions are going to achieve for us. And I think that will again lay a very strong foundation for human exploration in the further years. India, I think, is also planning its human space flight, human landing on the moon. So I think this will again lay a foundation for India's efforts towards its next missions towards the moon.
Interesting. Yeah. Thank you very much for these insights. So, Harini, as you know, after every episode, at the end of every episode, I would say, I ask this question about uh, what message would you like to give to the students? So, I'd like to repeat that question for you again on this episode.
Yes.
What message would you like to give to the students who are stepping into the field of like space exploration, but not from completely scientific perspective, as you're from political science and arts background, humanities, social sciences. So from people, from that areas, how they can contribute to the space exploration. Can you tell us briefly, so that there are a lot of students actually who listen to this podcast as well, so they can, take some good insights out of it.
I think my biggest message would be to, students who are like me exploring outer space, is that it is a new domain. You might feel like, oh, there's not much being done, or maybe it is not my place to look at the politics of the moon because I have no scientific knowledge, because that's sometimes something that even I might feel someday. But there is a clear understanding that the political science or the policy sector brings to this kind of a domain, not just space, but any technological domain. The policy and political understanding actually helps expand our knowledge on a subject like this. And I think in that case, if you're passionate about outer space and you're a political science student or an international relations student, foreign policy student, I think that passion can be expanded to understand the space domain itself. Even though I thought that I had less scientific understanding of the domain, I think while reading and while exploring the domain, I have understood how, at least broadly, how the domain works, or how science in outer space works. So I think your domain understanding will drive you to expand your knowledge on any subject that you're studying. So if you're passionate about something, please go ahead, explore the subject more, ask the right questions. I think there's very few people asking the right questions in subjects like this. We should be asking questions and getting answers. Give policy recommendations, even though you feel like nobody might read it. Go ahead and send emails, write to people, ask the right questions, and I think you'll be able to do well.
Thank you very much, Harini, for these insights. I hope the audience takes away a lot of good insights out of this episode. I mean, I already have had a lot of sessions on terrestrial conflicts, geopolitical aspect, but this is the first time that we are having a guest, a returning guest, I would say,
Mhm.
but for security political perspectives of lunar missions.
Yes.
So we hope to create more such episodes in the future, and we hope to have you again on the podcast. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. So I just had one more question probably before we close off.
Yes,
Uh, Something to you, I think something to the audience as well as
yes,
something
yes,
to ponder upon.
yes, yes. Please go ahead.
Uh,
Yes.
if we look at outer space, the orbits as something, Earth orbits as something as a property of the Earth because it's immediately extending the Earth. But Moon becomes an entirely different political domain. So how do we separate the politics of the Earth? Just like how you just mentioned, we have discussed the terrestrial politics, but how do we separate the terrestrial politics against the politics of something that is an entirely different or a new political domain as the moon or another planet? I think this is something that we could ponder upon and see how it goes.
Yes, I believe this is where the subject of common interest versus national interest comes into the play.
Yes.
I had recently actually written an article for a magazine called as SpaceRef,
Mm.
and there were like some of the mixed reactions, but there are several people who actually, I mean, I received a lot of response for that article. In this year, that was one of the highly reachable article, I would say.
Okay.
The thing that I mentioned over there is that one thing we are lacking at the moment in the space industry
Mm.
is the track to diplomacy, then the involvement of multilateral institutions in an effective manner,
Yes.
like think tanks and all. I
Yes.
mean, we have multilateral institutions like UN, but those are not enough.
Those are
They are fine to do regulatory aspect and all the things, but a member to member cooperation, like we saw for ISS.
mm.
I repeatedly give this example, like two states with no common interest,
Yes.
completely opposite of each other, US and Russia, were
Yes.
cooperating on ISS. And that is an excellent example of how we should move ahead in the space exploration domain.
Yes, sir.
Because this is very important going down the line, that we do not blur the lines between common interest and national interest. This should be kept separate,
Yes, sir.
and try, because if we keep it separate, then only we can try to achieve cooperative goals. Bringing them both together will possibly blur the lines, as we are seeing now in several of the conflicts happening. Even the Azerbaijan and Armenia conflict that is there, we see a
Yes, yes.
several group of nations supporting Azerbaijan on a supply side,
Yeah, yeah.
and several nations supporting Armenia. But that there is a rift somewhere that goes on. So the common interest and national interest should be very well defined, and
Mm.
more encouragement should be there for the think tanks. I hardly see any dedicated think tanks
Mm.
in the space domain. Fortunately, in India, there is one think tank which is started by one of my actually industry colleague only, Narayan Prasad.
Oh,
Some of his colleagues, they together have started this called Spaceport Sarabai. And
okay.
an episode before this, episode 30, is was from a guest who came from that think tank actually,
Oh,
Space Sarabai. So this kind of initiative should be there, because think tanks are very important when it comes to multilateral institutions. I mean, when you know the government talks don't work between certain nations, the track to diplomacy is mostly initiated. And in track to diplomacy, you will see a lot of external people apart from non-governmental people, taking participation into the talks and trying to resolve the conflict. So I believe there should be a dedicated wing in the space industry as well, because this has always happened. Like the Ukraine has been the prime example. Something happened here on the terrestrial conflict, and it has directly affected the space cooperation. OneWeb
yeah.
satellites were blocked by Russia because OneWeb was launching satellites using the Russian launcher. The
Yeah.
satellites were blocked, 36 satellites, I believe.
Yes, yes.
And then the ISS cooperation is no more the way it was. It is, for now, they're just continuing to complete the certain missions, but it is not healthy as it was. So, this has directly affected. So, imagine tomorrow, maybe, just imagine both ILRS and Artemis are cooperating together on Moon.
Yeah.
Something goes down here on the terrestrial conflict level.
Mm.
Want to mention about any specific incident from Pacific and all. Anything can go down, between the nations.
Yes.
Imagine the kind of havoc it might cause at that time, because now it is not only, it's beyond Earth orbit, you know,
Mm.
and the way politics might play out might not be good, because we will be having moon bases. Humans will be staying there. The human lives will be at stake. So
Yes.
to avoid that kind of situation, we really need to have this kind of channels, like track to diplomacy, where especially the think tanks can participate. And I believe the think tank participation is very important in the space industry, which we are not seeing, unfortunately, on a higher
Yes.
level.
Yes.
But yeah, hopefully we will see this in the coming years. So if these things should be in place, because these diplomatic instruments are very important to negotiate and resolve conflicts. Because as I mentioned, Ukraine is a very fresh example of how quickly things can escalate
Thanks. Yeah.
from the terrestrial conflict, the way it has affected. I mean, within a month things were down in the space
Yes.
industry. Within a month, it
Yes.
didn't
Yes.
even took a month. I thought there might be a committee that might be set up to resolve the issues. Scientific cooperation will still go on with Russia.
Hmm.
But yeah, within a month, thing took a toll.
Yes.
And that is a clear example, that is a clear sign that in the space industry we need this kind of participation, because you don't really know what can go wrong tomorrow when the conflict arises. So that's my perspective, actually.
That's actually very interesting. So I think I agree with you completely. The separation of collective and national interest should be very clearly defined at various levels. Only then we can achieve like a
Yes.
long term.
Yes. Sure then. Thank you very much, Harini.
Thank you.
I hope I have answered your question in a very well manner.
Yes, sir.
Yes, yes. And yeah, I look forward to have you on other podcast as well again,
Sure, sir.
as we have some more episodes in the pipeline. Sure
Yes,
then.
sir.
Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you so much, sir. You too.